Hello students and welcome to Political Science 1513, American Federal Government. I am your instructor, Connor Alford, and in this video we're going to begin to discuss some of the core concepts that you need to understand in order to make sense of American federal government and politics. Towards this end, we will talk about what government is, we'll talk about politics and legitimacy, we'll discuss what governments do, why we tolerate governments and their coercive influences in our life, and how governments are distinct from other forms of coercive organization or institution. Towards this end, we've got a series of 5 learning objectives that I would like you to focus on as you make your way through this lecture. The first learning objective asks for you to explain each of the following core concepts: government, institutions, politics, legitimacy, authority, and power. The second learning objective asks for you to identify the 3 main activities of all functioning governments. The third learning objective asks for you to discuss the main reasons why people accept governments and their coercive influence in our lives. The fourth learning objective asks for you to identify and explain the 6 constitutional functions of our American federal government. And then finally, the 6th learning objective asks for you to identify and describe the key features that we can use to distinguish governments from other forms of coercive institution, such as an organized crime syndicate, a terror cell, or a drug cartel. And we're going to begin at the very beginning by talking about the core concept of this entire course. So, what is government? Well, if you've done your reading, and remember, you should do your reading for each segment of lecture before beginning the video, then you know that government might be defined as, and I quote, the preeminent institution within a society. Government has the ultimate authority to decide how conflicts will be resolved and how benefits and privileges will be allocated, end quote. Now, this definition is functional. It's very by the book, it's very much in the box, but it works. It's technically correct, and I don't want you to think that I'm telling you that there's anything factually inaccurate in the statement that I just read to you. However, I don't like this definition, and I don't like it for a few reasons. On the one hand, it's got too many sentences, and on the other hand, I think that it's a somewhat complicated way to express a very simple idea, while at the same time missing out on a few of the key features that distinguish governments as unique concepts. So I'm going to offer an alternative definition that I would like you to focus on and that I would like you to jot down in your notes. Government is the institutional setting within which politics happens. So again, you can define government as the institutional setting where politics happens. However, in order to make sense of this definition, there are 2 subsidiary concepts that I need to familiarize you with. These are the term institution and the term politics. In order to know what it means to say that government is the institutional setting where politics happens, you need to know what politics is, and you need to know what it means to describe something as an institution. So when I tell you that government is an institutional setting, I want you to understand that this means that government is not a physical structure. Government is not a geographical setting. Government is not a particular place or location. It is an institution. It is a type of organization that outlasts the particular members within that organization. You can define the term institution as an ongoing organization or a set of rules and procedures that perform a particular function independent of the individuals within them. So, for instance, you can look at Southeastern Oklahoma State University. We are an educational institution. And what that means is that we are a set of organizational offices, rules, and procedures that work together to fulfill some central function. In our case, that's to educate the students, to make sure that you're learning what you need in order to pursue the careers that you are interested in pursuing. So we've got a central function that we're going to fulfill. And we're going to be working towards this educational operation independent of who happens to be your particular professor of political science, independent of what particular individual happens to be our university's president at a particular time. Our university switched presidents not that long ago, and yet we continued to educate our students very much the same way that we always have. And the American government works the same way. In the American government, one important place that we can look at is the executive branch, and in particular, we can look at the office of the presidency. The United States hasn't quite gone through 50 presidents yet, but we're getting pretty close. And what that means is that there have been 50 separate individuals that we have called president that have held that title, that have filled that seat, that have sat in that Oval Office. But these particular individuals, while they may be changing from time to time, every 4 or 8 years, they're all holding the same office. Our current president is in the same office, holds the same position in the same government that George Washington held, that was filled by Abraham Lincoln, that was held by Woodrow Wilson, FDR, JFK, or Ronald Reagan. All of these individuals held the office of presidency, but the presidency itself outlasted every single one of them. Most of the people who have fulfilled that particular position in government have passed away, and yet the position remains and continues to fulfill its central function. So governments are institutions. They are rules and procedures. They are organizations that outlast their members. And this is a really important thing to understand for a couple of reasons. On the first hand, the fact that governments are institutions means that governments tend to be quite permanent. If we simply had a particular individual who took power by threatening to detonate a nuclear bomb if people didn't obey him, well, that's fine and good, and maybe this individual is actually going to run things very well while he or she is alive, but the moment this person dies, we got to start over. Right? Because if the only claim to power is a threat of violence held by a particular person, then when that person dies, there's no real reason to continue following those rules and procedures. So institutions are important because they offer stability. They outlast individuals. They go beyond one generation or one lifespan. Institutions are also important because it's possible to participate in them without physically relocating yourself to a particular place. You can participate in government and politics in our country without ever traveling to the capital of Washington, D.C., or in our state without going to the capital of Oklahoma City. This is totally fine and possible. In the same way that you can get an education from Southeastern Oklahoma State University without ever actually stepping foot on our campus, right? Because we've got all of these online programs that allow people to get their degrees purely through the internet. And if you ask somebody who has completed one of Southeastern's purely online degree programs, where they got their bachelor's degree, where they graduated, they're going to tell you that they got their bachelor's degree, that they received their education from Southeastern, at Southeastern Oklahoma State University, even if they never actually stepped foot on their campus. Maybe their physical location was a couch in their living room in an apartment in San Francisco, California. But they're not going to tell you that they got their education from their sofa. They're going to tell you they got it from Southeastern, because Southeastern was the institution that facilitated that education. So that's what it means to say that government is an institutional setting rather than, say, a physical location or a geographical setting. But what is politics? What does it mean to say that government is where politics happens? Well, politics is the process by which we collectively make decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, and how. Okay, so politics, again, is the process by which we make collective decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, and how. And I do want to draw your attention to that bolded term, to the underlined term on this slide. Collectively has been emphasized because I do want you to understand that you cannot practice politics all by yourself. Politics necessarily requires a collective. It requires a group. And it requires interactions between individuals in this group that culminate in determining who gets what, when, where, why, and how. So if you're alone on an island, you might need to determine what you're going to get, when, and where. But that's not politics. You might need to decide, hey, should I eat all of my food right now, or should I ration it out? Should I create a merit system where I earn my ability to access food, where I reward myself for being productive by doing things like creating a fire or building a shelter? You're making decisions that are similar to some of the decisions that people have to make when they participate in politics, but that's not politics because you're all by yourself. If you're alone on an island trying to make these types of decisions, then your decisions are going to be purely psychological rather than political decisions. Your decision about whether to eat all your food now or to save some for tomorrow is going to be purely psychological. It's going to be based on your particular thought process. And you're not really going to have to worry about how other people react to your behaviors if you decide to scarf down all the food now. But if you're on an island with 10 other people, then that decision would become political, because all of a sudden it's a collective process where in deciding what you eat when, you have to consider how other people are going to react. And your consideration of those other people's reactions is going to affect your behavior in a way that cannot purely be explained by your own thought process, because your thought process is influenced by the thought processes of other individuals who will in turn be adjusting their behavior based on how you might react. So again, politics is a process by which a group of people, through their interactions, make decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, and how. Don't misunderstand this. That does not mean that politics is always a cooperative or a democratic process. One way in which a collective, a group, might make these types of decisions is by getting together and having a vote. We vote to ration out our supplies for 1 month, for 2 months, for 1 week. We vote to eat everything right now so that we get a surge of energy and we can start looking for more sustainable food sources. That's a form of politics, democratic politics, but politics can also be authoritarian. It can be very adversarial or tyrannical. For instance, if one of the individuals who's washed up on this island happens to have been the flight marshal and is therefore the only individual on the island with a firearm, he or she might attempt to use their access to this firearm to influence other people by saying, hey, I'm going to eat all of our coconuts right now, and there's nothing you can do about it, because if you try to interfere, I will shoot you. And then those people might actually acquiesce for fear of being physically harmed, at least until the flight marshal goes to sleep, in which case his head's probably going to get bashed in or he's getting thrown off the island. The bottom line is that whether it's confrontational or cooperative, when you have groups of individuals interacting to make these types of decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, and how, then you have politics. I do want to clarify one final point, however. The what and who gets what, when, where, why, and how does not necessarily refer just to physical or tangible goods and services. Okay, a part of what we need to do in politics is make determinations about who gets how much of our society's wealth, how to distribute food in a time of crisis, how to distribute water. And so yes, the what can sometimes refer to tangible goods or services, natural resources, or financially valuable items. But it can also refer to intangible, receptive items, such as rights, duties, or liberties. In our society, for example, we have decided that some people will have the duty of registering for the draft, whereas other people won't. More specifically, in the United States of America, young adult men have to register for the draft, but people in their 40s do not have to register for the draft. Women don't have to register for the draft. Children don't have to register for the draft. People with certain disabilities do not have to register, are exempt from the draft. And how did we come to this conclusion? How did we make this decision that particularly young adult men would be the ones who have this specific responsibility? Well, through politics, which took place in government. The government created rules saying that men within a certain age range would have to register for the draft, whereas other individuals would not. We have to make decisions about who will have the right to vote. Now, the right to vote is not a financial service. It's not a tangible good or service, but it is something that can be distributed and has been distributed to some people, but not to others. Adults of the age 18 who have not committed any felony, by and large, in our country, if they are citizens, get to vote. But children, felons, and foreigners don't get to vote. That was a decision made by our government through the process of politics. Your freedoms are, again, going to be political topics, issues that we need to address in government through the process called politics. So the what is not limited to physical resources, although it does encompass those. So the next major question we might want to ask then is, what does government do? And I want you to understand that all functioning governments fulfill three major operations. They legislate, administrate, and adjudicate the law. But let's break each of these three terms down. To legislate is to create the law. A legislator is a lawmaker. A legislature is a group of lawmakers. A piece of legislation is a proposed law that's going to be considered. And I want you to understand that governments govern. When I tell you that they legislate, administrate, and adjudicate, what I'm telling you is that they govern. You cannot govern people's activities unless you make rules telling them what they can and cannot do. So the first cardinal function of a successful government is to legislate. If at some point there is a terrible disaster and the legislative body within a government ceases to function so that government no longer creates rules telling people how to behave, well, then it is a failed government because it's not fulfilling the most fundamental function of a government. So the first function of any government is to legislate, create laws, rules telling people what they can and cannot do, or what they must or must not do. But those rules are only relevant in the real world if they are actually carried out and enforced on the ground level. So in addition to legislating, a government has to administrate. To administrate is to execute and enforce the law. So if Congress, the lawmaking organ of the American federal government, creates a law saying that everyone should pay 10% of their income in a tax designed to improve our infrastructure, then the government must then execute and enforce this law. If somebody refuses to pay their tax, the government has to send its own agents to that individual's bank and pull the money out, has to punish that individual for refusing to comply with the government's will. And once they have gathered that money, they have enforced the tax against people who don't want to pay it, they then have to carry out the purpose for which the tax money was raised. So if the law says that we're going to take a certain amount of money in order to improve our infrastructure, the government now has to execute that law by making sure that once it has gathered the money is actually spent in a way that results in better roads and infrastructure. So you've got to not only make the laws, create the laws, legislate, you've got to administrate, you've got to execute and enforce the laws. But we're not quite done yet, because another core function of government is to adjudicate the law. To adjudicate is to act as a judge, judgicate. And what that means is that when I tell you the government has to adjudicate the law, I am telling you that the government has to interpret the law. It has to resolve disputes about how the law should be interpreted and applied in particular cases. Because what we're going to discover is that it is not possible for a government to write laws that apply to every particular possible contingency that could ever occur. So instead, the government creates general rules that say things like, okay, don't murder people. And if you do murder somebody, then you will go to prison for X years. But then when you have special circumstances that emerge where it turns out that somebody was defending themselves, or maybe they thought they were defending themselves, you now need somebody to say, okay, hey, how does this general principle of please don't kill your neighbor apply in this particular circumstance, giving all of these mitigating factors? And that decision in our country is generally going to be made by judges, by courts, in the judicial branch of our government. It doesn't have to be a judge. In medieval countries, for example, you might have a magistrate appointed by the king, or perhaps the king himself might step in to help mediate your dispute with a rival landowning noble who is claiming property that you think is rightfully yours. So again, it's not enough just to create the laws and then to execute and enforce the laws. You have to help people figure out how the laws apply in their particular circumstances. You have to adjudicate. And these, again, are the three functions fulfilled by every successful government. I will emphasize the word successful. That's an important qualifier here. You have countries where the government has failed to fulfill one or more of these functions, and we call those failed states. failed governments. So for instance, in Somalia, there is a government. It does legislate. It creates rules, but it doesn't have the manpower to actually execute and enforce these rules or administrate. So it is a failed state. In other words, these are the three functions of a successful government, but not necessarily of all governments. Now, that being said, our government is generally considered successful. You might not like how it legislates, but it does legislate. You might not like how it administrates or adjudicates, but it does fulfill these core functions. And that's interesting because in legislating, administrating, and adjudicating the law, governments behave in ways that normally aren't acceptable for any individual or group of individuals. Governments do things that we would not otherwise tolerate from any other actor, things we normally aren't allowed to do. So for instance, the government tells us what to do by creating the law, and then it uses violence and coercion and the threat of violence or coercion to force us to comply with these laws. Governments control our spending and our voluntary interactions with other people. So for instance, the government in our country has decided that there will be an income tax, that you are only allowed to keep a certain percent of the money you earn through your own voluntary labor, and that the rest needs to be redistributed for other causes that the government deems more worthy. And that's problematic because nobody else is allowed to do this, right? If I were to see that you have money in a savings account that you're not currently using, I might come to the conclusion that, hey, that money could better be used if it were redistributed to more needy students. So I hacked into your bank account, I took some of your money, and I used it to buy textbooks for less fortunate students. And then I sent you a letter, and I said, hey, I've done your civic duty for you. You had this savings money. I've emptied it out. I've taken 20% of it. I've taken 50% of it, and I've used it to help feed hungry children and provide textbooks to disenfranchised students. Congratulations. You're welcome. You might be quite upset. You would probably call the cops because I've robbed you. That's theft. But this is interesting because those police officers are going to come and they're going to help the government do the exact same thing to other people. The difference is here that instead of calling it theft, we'll call it taxation. But it's the same thing. The government goes into people's bank accounts, it takes their money, and it redistributes that money as it sees fit. And if those people try to resist, if they refuse to pay their taxes, if they try to close their bank accounts or hide their assets from the government, well, then the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, works with law enforcement agents who work with the government, who are government employees, to capture that person and throw them in prison using physical force and coercion to compel obedience. So why is it acceptable for government to do this, but not for me, Connor Alford, or for your employer? Why can the government punish you for refusing to comply with its wishes using violence and force, but nobody else in society is allowed to do so? Well, generally speaking, when you talk to people about why they want the government in their lives, about why they don't want to live in a state of anarchy where you have no government and you have no institution able to impose rules, law, and order with force where necessary, you tend to get one of four broad answers. So what that means then is that we can identify four general reasons why people tolerate government, why you might actually want the government in your life, why you might actually accept this particular form of coercion by this particular actor. And the first of these four cardinal reasons why we might want government is that we desire consistent rules to structure our lives. In other words, we don't want a free-for-all, wild, wild west style society where we don't know what to expect from one another. I want to know that if I leave my house, I'm not going to get mugged, or that if I do get mugged, I have a legal recourse. I don't have to try to track the muggers down. I don't have to raise a mob of my friends and have a fight with my robbers to reclaim my property. I can call the cops and I can let them try to reclaim my property, or at the very least, hold my mugger accountable for his or her actions. And so what we're going to find is that the desire to have structure, to have law and order, is an important reason why people turn to government. But why specifically government? Why not let our employer? Or why not let our parents? Or why not let a particular prominent citizen in our neighborhood try to provide these rules to structure our lives? Well, first off, that's kind of a matter of opinion. Some people think that we should go that way. But by and large, people aren't satisfied with this because we don't just want any rules, we want consistent rules. If the rules are changing from one day to the next, they're not that useful. I might be protected from robbers today, but if the rules are changing all the time, that may or may not be true tomorrow. And if the rules are based purely upon the judgment of one respected citizen in a local area, that's all good and fine while that citizen's alive. But what happens when he or she passes away? Well, all of a sudden, we have to pick a new decision maker who will create a whole separate set of rules that could be very different from the ones we've become accustomed to. So that creates inconsistency, instability. And that's why it's important to understand that governments are institutions. The fact that governments are institutions means that they can provide rules that will outlast the lifespans of the particular individuals in that institution. We don't have to start over every time a president retires or passes away. So governments are arguably a good or even necessary force in society, first because they provide us with generally consistent rules to structure our lives. The second reason why people tend to want to create and tolerate governments is that we desire neutral mediators of disputes when we have disagreements with strangers. If, for instance, you're driving to work and you get into a fender bender and you think the other motorist is at fault and should have to pay for the damages to your car, but that motorist thinks that you are at fault and should have to pay for the damages to his or her car, you've got a dispute. And you need a third party that doesn't have a dog in the fight in order to come to a fair conclusion. So, for instance, if you and I were the motorists and I thought that it was your fault and you should have to pay for my damages, you couldn't trust me to fairly mediate that dispute. If I were the judge, I would have a bias in my own favor. And so it's much more useful if we don't know each other but we have a disagreement, if there is a third party and that we both agree to follow who we can turn to, and that's the government. Well, what if that third party makes a decision and I refuse to follow it? Well, fortunately for us, the government also has the power to impose its decisions as a mediator of disputes. So if it says that I have to pay for your damages, but then I refuse to pay for your damages, well, it can go ahead and send men with guns and force me to follow through with that decision, whether I like it or not. I do want to emphasize that governments provide a theoretically neutral mediator because we know that historically they haven't always been as neutral and unbiased as perhaps we would like them to be. If you are a black man in 1950s America and you've been accused of sexually assaulting a white woman, for instance, you're probably not going to get a fair trial unless you fight tooth and nail, take a case all the way to the Supreme Court, and impose that fair trial upon the state. So sometimes what we're going to find is that states are not as neutral as they ought to be. Governments are not as neutral as they ought to be. But by and large, for the most part, they do a better job of fairly mediating our disputes than we do, because by and large, they don't have a dog in the fight, whereas we do, and we tend to be biased in our own favor. The third reason why people tend to want the government is that governments do, in fact, help to provide public services that are hard to provide by ourselves. Things like roads and infrastructure are often easier to create when you have a government agency or actor with the authority to compel cooperation than they would be without that government. And to illustrate why this might be, think about a group assignment where you and 4 or 5 other students have been asked to complete a project, and you're left more or less to your own devices. You're all going to get the same grade regardless of who did what share of the work. Well, we've all been in that situation. We all know exactly what happens. One student does all the work, and everyone gets the same grade. And that works in isolated circumstances. If this is one group project, it might be worth the while to go ahead and just do the work, let everyone else get a free ride. But if you get placed with that same group over and over and over again, eventually you might get tired of being the only one who does any of the work while everyone else gets the same benefit, and you say, that's it, I'm done. I'm not going to do the work unless you do your fair share, and if you're not willing to do your fair share, we'll just fail together. This is what political scientists call the free rider issue. It is a type of collective action problem that occurs when you have people who stand to benefit from cooperating but fail to do so because some individuals in this group are hoping to get a free ride to receive all of the benefits of the collective project without personally contributing any of the work. Well, one way that you could solve this problem is to have a professor who hovers over your shoulder and who pays attention and says, okay, look, this student's not doing their fair share of the work, so they're not going to get the grade. This student did all the work, so he or she is going to get the grade. The rest of you lazy jerks, well, you fail. Okay, that's the professor fulfilling the function of government. Roads are the same thing. We all want to drive on the roads. We all benefit from having good roads with fewer potholes and higher quality asphalt, but none of us are happy when it's tax season. But fortunately, for those of us who enjoy roads, you don't have to be happy to pay your taxes. It's not a choice. Whether you are the one who paid for the roads or not, you can benefit from them. And that means that a lot of us are incentivized to try to get a free ride. We will use the roads, but we will try not to pay our taxes if those taxes are voluntary. But they're not, because the government has the power not only to create taxes, but to execute and enforce those taxes, compelling us to pay them whether we like it or not. So that makes it easier to do things like fund our roads. And this is one reason why many people are willing to accept behaviors from the government that are unacceptable for any other type of actor. Finally, and this is the most fundamental function of all governments, we want to feel safe and protected from force and fraud. Now, when I say force, I mean domestically, within our own country, we want to be protected from crime, but I also mean at an international level, we want to be protected from foreign aggression. If China were to invade the United States, we wouldn't want it to be a free-for-all where each of us has to grab our own gun and stand up against this massive army. And fortunately for us, we wouldn't have to, because the United States is a very powerful military, and the United States would mobilize that military to defend our country from these foreign aggressors. So it's protecting us from force at home by criminals and abroad by foreign powers or terrorist groups. But it's not just force that we want to be protected from. Right? We don't want people using violence or the threat of violence to do things like take our belongings or enslave us, but we also don't want them using deception or fraud. We don't want to be deceived or tricked into indentured servitude. So really, when I tell you that the government is there in part to protect you from fraud, what I mean is that we want the government to enforce our agreements and contracts with other individuals. For instance, let's say that you have agreed to help an employer build a bridge, and that employer promises that once the bridge is built, they will give you $10,000. So you go, you build the bridge, and then they only give you $2,000. That's not what you agreed to. You have been defrauded. Now, if there were no government, you would have to find a way to work that out. Maybe you go and tear down the bridge and refuse to repair the damages until the employer pays you. But that's a lot of hassle, and we don't want to deal with it. So instead, we turn to the government. And hey, if your employer doesn't pay you for the hours you've worked, even though they agreed to pay you an hourly wage, you can turn to the government, and it will force your employer to follow through with this end of the agreement. So again, the government is there in part to protect you from force and fraud. And these are the four general reasons why governments exist all around the world. However, it is interesting to note that these ideas have actually manifested themselves in the United States Constitution and are actually applied by our Constitution to our own American federal government. So on this slide, what you can see is the preamble of the Constitution, and you probably know this language even if you can't recite it. But the preamble says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. And the preamble is fulfilling a lot of functions. The language of we the people, for instance, is telling us that this is a social contract and that all of the government's power, legitimacy, and authority comes from the people and our consent to be governed by the government. But for our purposes here, pay attention to these underlined terms, because what they're doing is they are identifying the 6 constitutional functions of American federal government. The first of which is simply to improve, to make the union of the states in our countries more perfect, more towards the benefit of our posterity and our liberty. Establish justice. That's that law and order principle that I was just talking about. It means create courts, create rules and procedures to help us mediate our disputes, ensure domestic tranquility. That means protecting us from force and fraud. We don't want riots in the streets on a daily basis. Provide for the common defense. Again, they're defending us from foreign aggression. Promote the general welfare. Hey, that's providing public goods and services. And by the way, this language, promote the general welfare, sometimes confuses modern students, because when we hear the term welfare, we think about things like food stamps. But that's not really what was in mind at the time that the Constitution was written. The idea of a welfare state is a product of the mid-1900s. It wasn't even something that the framers would have thought about or considered desirable. When they say promote the general welfare, they're talking about national improvements, things like building highways, canals, and railroads. Secure the blessings of liberty. Protect our freedoms. We don't want people enslaving us either through force or fraud. And so what we're discovering is that the preamble identifies the limited goods that the government is supposed to provide for the governed. Government, in other words, what this is all telling us is that government exists for our benefit. Government exists to benefit the governed by doing things like providing us with consistent rules to structure our lives, serving as a neutral mediator when we have disputes with strangers, providing public services that would otherwise be difficult to achieve, and making us feel safe and protected from force and fraud, either by criminals or foreign powers. But if that's true, if the government is for our benefit, why does it need violence and coercion? Why do we need police and military forces with firearms? And why must people be compelled to do things like pay their taxes if the taxes are levied for our own benefit? What other good or service is so great that people have to be forced to pay for it? Well, understand that there are reasons why all governments are inherently coercive institutions. And I do, by the way, need you to understand, all governments are inherently coercive institutions. They use force, they use violence, and the threat of violence to compel obedience and control people's behavior in ways that normally we would describe as horribly immoral and even tyrannical or unacceptable, but that we are willing to tolerate from the government. Well, to understand this, I want you to take a moment and imagine that you were invisible for a day. And ask yourself, what would you do if you were invisible for a day? In my in-person classes, when I ask this question, usually there's 1 or 2 people who will say, I would go and I would rob a bank, or I would go shoplifting. I've had students tell me that they would take that opportunity to get some revenge against old bosses or people who had wronged them, former spouses, so on and so forth. And when I ask them, well, why don't you do that right now? I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to get in trouble. So what we're going to find is that if the government doesn't have the ability to actually forcibly punish you for your actions, the government isn't able to fulfill that central function of administration. The government can't help us to overcome the free rider issue, those collective action problems, and provide roads unless it has the ability to force people to pay their taxes. So at the end of the day, the government is essentially a form of protection racket. What do I mean by that? Well, a protection racket is a form of organized crime activity that was very popular among certain syndicates, such as the mafia in the United States, and that continues to play a role all around the world. If you go to Sicily, for example, there's a whole bunch of business owners that continue to pay extortion money to the mafia in exchange for its protection. A protection racket is an offer you can't refuse. Imagine that you live in a neighborhood where there aren't very many police, where the police don't usually care what happens. And so you've got all of these hoodlums. You've got people who are breaking your windows, stealing your products, and you want protection. A protection racket is when the mafia or another organized crime syndicate sends men with guns into your store and they say, hey, look, we're here to help, and here's what I want you to do. You're going to pay me, let's say, 20% of all the money you earn operating your business. And in exchange for that, I'll make sure no one's breaking your windows or stealing your things. But what happens if you say, no, thank you, Mr. Mafia Man. I think I can manage on my own. I've got my own guns in the back. Well, then they break your stuff. They take your products, or they lock you up. They use force. They use violence to punish you for refusing to participate in their protection racket. And if that sounds familiar, well, it should. Because that's the exact same thing that government does with law enforcement, right? The government says, hey, look, there are criminals out there. We want law and order, so we're going to have a police force that will arrest criminals and that will punish people who break the law. And in order to pay these law enforcement agents, we're going to raise taxes where we take your money. What happens if you tell the government, I'm not going to pay this? Well, then they're the ones who come and they take your things. They send men with guns, and they will use physical force to restrain you, lock you up, and physically punish you in some way in order to force you to obey. So how then is government distinct from the mafia? What separates government from organized crime syndicates? Well, to some extent, again, this is a matter of opinion. Some people would argue that there is no real difference, but I think perhaps it would be more accurate to say that there is no morally relevant difference. And again, that's purely a matter of opinion. You can argue that the differences between government and, say, the mafia are not morally relevant, but you can't argue that they don't exist very well, at least not under the current academic understanding. Generally speaking, what I'm trying to tell you is that the academic community broadly understands governments to be distinct from organized crime in a few different ways. First, it is worth noting that governments tend to have more power than any other actors in their society, at least the successful ones. Somalia, again, is an exception to this general rule. Power is the ability to make other people do something they otherwise wouldn't, to compel or convince others to behave in a way that is consistent with your will. And there are many different types of power. Money, for example, provides financial power. If I had $1 million, I could probably pay you to do labor that you would not want to do on your own. If I offered you $1 million to do 10 jumping jacks, you would probably do 10 jumping jacks. But if I didn't have $1 million and I just said, hey, do jumping jacks, you would tell me to shove it. Because power means that I cause you to act in a way that you otherwise wouldn't. Now, one form of power is financial power, but there's also what we call coercive power. And that's the ability to force somebody to do something under the threat of violence. A very, very large and muscular man might have more physical coercive power than a very small, skinny man, such as myself. Authority is the right to wield coercive power. And generally speaking, the academic community understands authority to be the second feature which distinguishes governments from organized crime. So first, governments tend to have more power, more of an ability to make people comply with their wishes than organized crime. But second, people generally recognize the government has a right to wield this coercive power. If the government says that you need to pay your taxes, well, most of us say the government has the ability, has the right. It is appropriate for the government to tax us. Whereas if the mafia tried to tax us, if I tried to tax you, that would probably be outside of my rights as an individual. I'm not the government. Where does the right to wield coercive power come from? Well, that depends on your philosophy. In the Western world, we generally understand that the right to wield coercive power comes from we the people, that governments get their authority to govern by the consent of the governed, of the people they want to rule over. But that's not necessarily true in, say, Saudi Arabia or in medieval Europe, where your authority was supposed to have come from God. You had a divine right to rule. And this actually helps lead us up to the next major important distinguishing feature. Governments, generally speaking, are more legitimate than organized crime, syndicates, or other forms of coercive institution. Legitimacy is popular acceptance of authority. By and large, most of us believe that the government has the authority to do things like take our money and redistribute it towards the funding of colleges, libraries, and roads, whereas very few of us believe that the mafia or that our employers have the authority to do the exact same thing. In other words, the big factor which distinguishes governments from organized crime is legitimacy. We accept these activities by the government because we believe that the government has the right to behave in this way. We do not accept them by any other actors because we do not believe that those actors have the same authority. So to summarize all of this, I want you to understand that the real factor which distinguishes governments from organized crime, which distinguishes a successful government from other forms of coercive institution, is that a government has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence or force. Right? The single most important factor distinguishing governments from organized crime is a monopoly on the legitimate, the broadly accepted use of violence to compel obedience and enforce decisions. And that will bring us to a conclusion in the first half of this week's lecture.